Hi, this is Carleen Johnson, Washington State government reporter for the Center Square, Washington, with another episode of Washington in Focus Daily. And today we're going to be talking about Superintendent Chris Reykdal and how he hopes any revenue from the proposed income tax is going to come his way for the most part to fund education. In addition, I did get to sit down with him to ask some further questions that I'm guessing will be of interest to watch in future episodes. Also going to get into a conversation that I had this week with Insurance Commissioner Patty Kruderer. She's pushing a law to make insurance fraud a felony. So we'll get into that. And a bill to create a task force to, for all intents and purposes, gut the Public Records Act is something that a couple of my colleagues here at the Center Square, Washington, are going to be discussing in another part of our podcast. So let's jump into this. I did get an opportunity this morning to sit down with Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, Chris Reykdal, after a morning press conference where he laid out, I should say, his push for using most of the projected $3.5 billion that an income tax, should it pass this session and be upheld in the courts, generate each year to help, he says, struggling families with some property tax relief and some other education-related priorities. So he's calling this his middle-class prosperity vision. And he says this is all about, prioritizing families first and making education, which is the paramount duty of the state for education purposes. He says this is where the money's got to go. If we're going to pass this income tax, it's going to be upheld in the courts. Everybody's going to agree it's constitutional and we're moving forward with this thing. He's like, I want the lion's share of the profits from that. So during the press event, after he laid that proposal out, I got an opportunity to ask about his resistance to having the state of Washington opt in to the federal tax credit program for education, which a nonpartisan group estimates could conservatively bring in about $732 million a year for Washington K through 12 education. So you'd get to take a $1,700 deduction on your federal income taxes and then redirect that into education priorities that you want. It could go to the K through 12 public education system. It could go to a private school. It could go to tutoring. If your child needs some tutoring help, it could pay for additional transportation, special education, a number of priorities. But the superintendent is highly resistant to it. Governor Ferguson has to opt us into that federal program. Otherwise, we don't get to take part and participate and have those proceeds come back here to the state of Washington. So at the end of the press conference, his part of the press conference, I was able to ask him why he is opposed to keeping that money here instead.
What I have said is families with kids in schools consistent with this affordability approach absolutely need a tax credit for having kids for school, public and private. That can be done through the tax code, not by the state picking and choosing kids who are going to get scholarships to fund religious education. I don't think that's appropriate, but there's a way to get every family, public or private, some more help. And I think if it goes back to Congress and they actually turn this into a tax credit for families, that's the way to go. If they don't choose to do that and they say it's up to each state, I suspect at some point we will be in, and we should be in, if we can control what that looks like.
So after that press event, I did have an opportunity to sit down and ask some further difficult questions of Superintendent Reykdal. To his credit, he granted me that one-on-one interview, talking about the initiatives and some of the other highly controversial positions that his office has taken in the last couple of years with, gender policy and that sort of thing. So we're going to be getting into that in a future episode. So that's my tease for that. I did also speak, as I mentioned, with the Patty Kruderer, who is our Washington State Insurance Commissioner. Now, she is backing a bill to make insurance fraud in Washington State a felony crime. So it's a fairly rare case of introducing a new felony into state law. The Senate was sent it to the Rules Committee, so it could get pulled onto the Senate floor really at any time. I looked at the calendar of bills that are expected to come up for full floor votes today, and I did not see this piece of legislation on there. But she told me pretty confidently that she thinks this is going to move forward. And it does have, I should note, bipartisan support. Both Republicans and Democrats think that this is a good idea. And it's because insurance fraud is not the insurance fraud of years ago. You've got, in some cases, organized crime operatives, getting in on insurance fraud, not just in the state of Washington, but nationwide. So here's part of my conversation with Insurance Commissioner Kruderer on why she's requesting this bill.
Insurance fraud was not defined as a crime, so it fell under other statutes, theft statutes mainly, which is very limiting, quite frankly, because of the short statute of limitations. Sometimes these crimes are very small in amount, so they fall under the misdemeanor, gross misdemeanor statutes, but they can actually hit thousands of people. And so the aggregate sum could be well above what a felony would be. So we felt that, and the way that fraud is being committed these days is much more sophisticated, much more technology driven. And so we wanted to update and modernize our statute to give us the tools and the resources that we need to go after today's insurance fraud.
So a bill that would create a task force to essentially gut the Public Records Act, which is pretty important for journalists like myself and some of my colleagues, seems to be moving ahead. That's just one of several pieces of legislation, actually, that would make amendments and maybe create some new obstacles to, access to public records, whether you're Joe Citizen or Joe Journalist. It seems like there are a number of different lawmakers moving forward with efforts to curtail that, or at least, create those additional obstacles. So my colleagues, TJ Martinell, who is our investigative reporter here for the Center Square of Washington, and Tim Clauser, who covers legislative things as well as a big focus on Eastern Washington and Spokane. They sat down today to talk about this bill and their concerns. And here's part of that conversation.
TJ, you wrote a story about frivolous records requests. In the state's attempt to combat these, they're trying to save taxpayer dollars, but critics are saying it could cut off or pose barriers to transparency. Tell me about this proposal.
Yeah, so it's House Bill 2661. It was sponsored by Representative Skylar Rude. And the bill, just to get to the ending, right away, they cleared it from committee, but they radically changed it. There's no longer going to be a task force as they were originally going to do. They're going to have another type of existing state committee look at this issue and report back to the legislature. And so I think what it does is it would give the legislature a report on and looking at the issue of overly burdensome or frivolous public records requests. And so it's an interesting topic because there were two questions that were raised during the public hearing, and at least one of them was asked explicitly is there ever a frivolous records request? And I think the issue then would be, how would you define it? Because there are instances where everybody knows it's a frivolous request, but is it burdensome? And also, how do you prove intent? Because that's the issue at that point. And how would you have who would get to decide whether it's frivolous or not? Would the government entity do that? Would someone else? And how would you maintain impartiality with that? And so, I've written about records requests I've made that have gotten some local government entities to push back and say, this is too burdensome, we can't do this. Whereas other local governments have complied and provided me with records about it. And so I think one of the things to look at, and what's interesting is, with all these records requests I've filed, there's some cases where I have to pay, they send me an invoice before I get the records, I have to pay for it. And typically they're not too much. Like, one was like $1.25. That's not a terrible, that's not a high price to pay for records in Washington State. Yeah, pennies. We're talking pennies. And so I think that might be something that they could look at, is creating a system where they can look at how much is this going to cost. Because this is actually an interesting point. When someone files a very extensive public records request that takes a long time, requires resources, it takes up staff time, ultimately taxpayers are paying for it. So in as much as having public access to records is important, and it seems like some of the people I've spoken to who are in favor of this task force, they're saying, look, they were not interested in changing exemptions to the public records Act or making it more restrictive. What they were interested in is avoiding situations where they in their mind are either burdensome or it's being used to harass individuals. And so again, one man's harassment is another man's accountability, right? So, I mean, that's the issue at hand. So that's kind of where things are at. The bill cleared its original committee, and I think the interesting thing is going to be it can still get amended again on the House floor. So what is that going to look like? And is the bill sponsor going to be supportive of the bill in its current form? I think that's a good question to ask as well.
So in its current form, is it looking at, I get that the issue is frivolous and burdensome record complaints, but is it intentionally frivolous? Because you spoke to it a little bit. I filed a ton of records requests and you're looking for information, but maybe the difference of 5 words in your records request could be the difference between getting 5 emails and 500. And you don't want to cut yourself off to that. So I file broad records requests, but it's because I'm trying to get all those records. But I too have had cities and counties reach back to me and say, hey, look, you're looking for a lot here. We're going to need some more direction. You need to narrow this down. And I'm willing to work with them on that. But right. I mean, for a state, city, local government to be able to say, well, we think that this is intentionally frivolous when I'm just trying to provide accountability, like you're saying, I mean, that could pose some concerns.
Yeah, I think and that's where it's, you really have to ask yourself, where does the line get drawn? And how do you codify that into state law? That's going to be the big question for lawmakers, especially ones who are who want to maintain government transparency. And, the Public Records Act that we have in Washington State is actually very, very broad in terms of what we get access to. So I think it kind of goes back to the issue of cost. How much is it costing a school district or a city or a county to comply with a records request? And I think the question I have for these local governments is what in their opinion is a overly burdensome, overly broad or frivolous or harassing public records request, because they're all public. A public records request is public. So show me what one of them looks like, because I want to know what you guys think what kind of records requests are you guys trying to not have to deal with, and why?
Yeah, I'd like to see the data behind that too. 'Cause we spoke to it. These things we're trying to provide taxpayer accountability, but at the same time, this accountability is costing the taxpayer. Right. And we've both spent money on records requests. Sometimes it's a few dollars. Sometimes they're asking for hundreds of dollars for what seems like not a lot of work. But we're also not on the other side of that veil. We don't know what kind of work is going into it all the time. But I would be interested to see, like, okay, well, you think this is frivolous and burdensome. Show me a similar request and how much it costs. Not only what you were charging them, but what it cost you guys in man hours. Because maybe they'll charge us $100. Maybe that costs them $500 in man hours because they have 3 people looking into it for several days.
Yeah, I think that's probably going to, I wonder if that's going to be the compromise that's kind of addresses this issue, is if they say, we don't want to make changes to the Public Records Act. We don't want to redact more stuff. We don't want to create more exemptions. But at the same time, we're trying to cut costs for compliance for local governments and save taxpayers some money. So how about we create a system where you have to pay for this stuff if it's going to cost the government over a certain amount in terms of resources or time. Here's how much it's going to cost you. And if you're willing to pay, then great. Here's the records. We're not withholding anything. We're not concealing anything. You get the records that you want, but you are going to have to pay for it. And if you're not willing to pay for it, I think that I could see a lawmaker arguing that it's a case of putting your money where your mouth is. You say you want these records, it's going to cost you $75, but if you're not willing to pay, how badly do you want these records? So
yeah, I mean, in the same breath, though, I think that it raises other concerns, because it's not always journalists that are filing these requests. I mean, I live next to a very small town, and they're going through an infrastructure crisis, and the mayor there felt like there was issues going on with how the state was handling it. and she filed it. She doesn't make a lot of money. She filed for all these records, got them, and was able to illustrate what was going on with the state. But I mean, she doesn't have, she has the support of her small town local government that makes almost no money in revenue every year, but she doesn't have the support of a national media outlet or even a regional media outlet out of Seattle and Tacoma to put that funding behind them. So I think this also begs the question as to, who is going to have to pay and who doesn't. Does everyone have to pay, whether it's hundreds of dollars or not, even if they're not in media and make less than $50,000 a year? And at the same time, you do a lot of work on reporting on the Public Records Act. How many exemptions are there already?
They've added them over the years, and they're trying to add more in some cases. And there's one bill that would create an exemption for state employees' identities if they claim that they were a victim of a hate crime.
Are we talking tens, dozens, or hundreds of exemptions though?
I'd have to look back and see how many there are, but it's grown over the years. And so I think and then there was that proposal that was initially filed to make daycare centers location, like information, exempt from public disclosure, which it was so unpopular that the bill sponsor just said, okay, we're dropping this issue. It's not popular. So you're seeing a lot of different narratives and dialogues going on over this thing. So we're obviously going to continue to keep an eye on it, because for taxpayers, it's about being able to have access to records that are the result of their tax dollars. So that's it's going to be obviously we're going to keep an eye on what this committee's report says and what any recommendations that they might make. But that all depends on whether the bill survives in its current form, because it just radically got changed the other day in terms of how it's going about this.
Yeah, lots of changes, still lots of time in the session. Well, lots of time in this short session to make changes. But we'll continue to be on top of your coverage of this, TJ. And for anyone wanting to read that, they can read it at thecentersquare.com.
One more thing to mention before we wrap up today, this afternoon here, which is, I think, day 26 of the legislative session. I think I'm losing track since it's a short session. Everything's crammed together. But the legislation that we've talked about quite a bit here at the Center Square and in Washington in focus is the creation of a state board to decertify a sheriff. That bill is set for another public hearing in the Senate Ways and Means Committee today. This is the one where Pierce County Sheriff Keith Swank unleashed some fire, I'll say, on Democrats in a hearing the very first week of the session. There's been a lot of attention to that. He even got some international media attention for his comments. So I'm going to be attending that hearing this afternoon, let you know what happens to that bill, if in fact it gets out of Senate Ways and Means and then moves on from there to rules, and then quickly could be called up on the Senate floor for a full vote. So promise to keep you up to speed on that one. There's a great deal of public interest in that bill. So thank you so much for watching another episode of Washington in Focus Daily, and for your interest in all the stories that we're writing on. I would direct you, if you're interested in these things, to our page at the Center Square Washington for more articles like this, not just my coverage, but all of my colleagues who are working real hard to keep you up to speed on everything that we're covering, especially during this crazy legislative session. So again, thank you for your interest. And this has been another episode of Washington in Focus Daily. I'm Carleen Johnson. Thanks for watching.